And we're back. Spacetrain is constructed, currently burning out to Joule. We left the montage. It was built in orbit around Kerbin and then left the Kerbin sphere of influence. Here I am moving the fuel around. As the Spacetrain depletes its fuel supplies, the caboose / space tug here at the end will remove the empty fuel cars and strategically place them in space so that they can be space antique debris, so that future generations of space explorers can cherish these valuable collectibles and reminisce about the time that we used large containers of liquid fuel to power our space travel. Ha! How great it'll be. But for now it's just junk in space, because although the tug could push it into something, like into a collision course with something, I really decided later that I didn't want to waste the fuel. I designed this ship with the intention of getting one full orange container out to Laythe orbit. Kind of like the international, like Scott Manley always says, right? The international standard for refueling is an orange container, right? So unlike most ships, they just need to get that orange container into orbit around Kerbin, or maybe orbit around Mun if they're constructing around Mun. Or the moon. I always call it Mun. That you, right? Alright, so we're finishing our burn. This was after an hour-long burn to get my Joule encounter. I did some tweaking and got it to get it so that I would get an aero capture. So now I'm going to dump this last. Took 2 fuel cells, basically, to get from Kerbin to Joule. Aero capture, periapsis encounter. So I'm in good shape. I figure if I can get a good orbit out of my aero capture, then it won't take a whole nother orange can to get my Laythe encounter and Laythe capture. So I feel like I might actually have extra at this point. I hit the port a little hard and bounced there. I like this video because there's lots more docking. The montage of the construction had lots of docking, and then this because the tug is doing all these little docks. Alright, so the Spacetrain is now 2 cars light. The mission profile for this trip isn't been predefined. Alright, here we go. We're about to get our Joule capture. Basically, the idea was send supplies out to the Laythe base so that the Laythe base could do some exploring and do some scientific work for a change. No mission profile was set, just basically the Laythe base would get to decide based on however much fuel made it out there, depending on how well I aero captured and how well I got my encounter the first time and such. So I'm pretty pleased. We've got the Spacetrain engine at the front with the 2 rockets. This is just me summarizing the ship here since it was constructed in the previous video with no commentary. Then we've got 1 fuel car, and then we've got a cargo car with a lander rover for scientific endeavors that the Laythe base may want to proceed. Alright, while the train is creating an orbit around Laythe, we're going to bring some crew up from Laythe so that they can meet up with the ship and explore another Joule satellite. Alright, since there's already a Kerbal on the ship and I want to bring all the Kerbals back down to the surface of Laythe, right? I need to have an empty seat. So, drew straws, and I think it's Charlie and Devlay. Since the preview window is too small, I can't read the names on there. I think it's Devlay. I can't remember. But they're gonna take off. This is my first time ever using the VTOL single stage to orbit ship to create an orbit from Laythe's surface, so I'm excited. I cut the vertical engines a little early there. You can see I dipped kind of close to the ground, but that's kind of cool. Makes for a more cinematic takeoff. Okay, so the docking for the ship is pretty awesome. Oh, I've never done, like I said, I've never done an orbit from Laythe's surface before with this ship, so I had to do a dive to gain speed and keep my air intake up, and now I'm climbing again, and I'm about to decide to switch to rockets, because I feel like my speed is going to, once I reach, I think it's around 1,200 meters per second, I realize I'm probably going fast enough where I can switch to rockets. My rocket, the solid, or the oxidized fuel tanks are completely topped off. The only ones that weren't topped off were the liquid fuel tanks. Because I knew that Laythe's atmosphere was lower than Kerbin's and the gravity's weaker, so I knew that the air-breathing engines just wouldn't work for very long. So there was no point in topping those engines off. Those tanks off, I should say. Alright, so we fired the rockets, and now I cut the air breathers and closed the air intakes, and now I'm going to create an orbit around Laythe. And once I get an orbit around Laythe, I'm going to create my mission profile, basically, because that's when I can do calculations. I'm going to look at how much fuel is in the shuttle here, the single-staged orbit shuttle. Because what I want to do is I want the shuttle to go as deep into Laythe orbit as it can to conserve fuel, because it's the smaller of the two ships, right? So the farther out it can go to meet the train, the more fuel I'll save, because the train is leaving for another satellite, right? So the closer it gets to Laythe, the more wasted fuel it's going to have to burn to escape Laythe. So it might as well stay as far out in Laythe orbit as it can. That's the logic. So the mission profile will be probably, I mean, if there's not a lot of fuel left, which I already know, the space train's got already probably half a container extra of fuel, it seems like. So I know that BOP probably won't be my goal. I mean, Pole. Pole is going to be the goal with low fuel, because it would be, I could RCS land, just get a low orbit, and all the fuel could just be spent getting my encounters back and forth. And Laythe encounter is easy because it's got an atmosphere, right? So I can arrow capture again. Or I could do just send the caboose down to like Tylo or something where it wouldn't come back up. And that's scientific too. Because the shuttle itself here, as you'll see, I was watching the shuttle there go around the surface while I was calculating the mission profile. Ooh, I docked. This ship was so well designed that I don't have the UI on, and I didn't rotate the ship in front of me to line the ports up. Instead, I'm going to just use the maneuverability of my single-staged orbit ship, because I designed these RCS ports so well that it takes almost no RCS to move it exactly the way I want. I'm going to dock this with no UI and no aligned ports pre-pan. And I use that light. The way I put the light on the ship is specifically for docking. I know if the tip of the bottom of the, or the top of the light is touching the port, then the... Because if you see the light is on the bottom, right? It's pretty good design. I love this ship. And it's not even my latest model. It's like version 3, and I have like a version 5. But this is the only one that's functioning on the Laythe surface, because the single-stage orbit ship with the wheels on it exploded from the Kraken. Alright, we are docking. Just a little wiggling from the magnetism here. And then the snap. Alright, so I'm going to shift all the fuel around. I did a little quick check there to make sure nothing was broken. You know, systems check. Alright, shifting the fuel. I want to make sure that the single-staged orbit is got all solid, I mean oxidized fuel it would ever need, because again, liquid fuel is not, I'm not really hurting for liquid fuel. I've got a lot of it on the surface, and just the Laythe atmosphere is so thin. So I always just mostly worried about oxidized. So the oxidized fuel is completely topped off, and then I dump the remainder of the fuel into the liquid tanks. And now I'm going to move the crew over into the train so that they can do their scientific mission. Dug a little check there to make sure everybody's seated and ready to go. You can see I put the 2 idiots in the crew container, in the hitchhiker container, and the 1 smart guy is piloting. This crew is not very bright. Alright, so I accidentally decoupled the tug without pulling apart the tank first. I had to redock, and then now I'm going to pull the tank off, because this tank's empty now. Only thing that's in it is oxidizer, and I have an excess of oxidizer. So, though, you might ask yourself, why not just have no tug and just drop the tanks off the back? Well, the thing is, a lot of times during, the tanks would run out maybe in situations where I need to move the tank away from the ship, maybe because I'm burning in a braking direction, so the tank would collide into me or something. And I don't want to have each tank have a probe core on it and be able to pilot itself and have all that extra weight. So the tug works as like a probe that can move things around without having every single piece be able to fly itself. I don't know. I've never used this design. It was my first tug, and I kind of liked it. It was fun. It made the mission more fun. Alright, decoupling from the ship. We're going to leave the single-stage orbit there now, so we're going to come back later to return to Laythe surface with it. Alright, so now I'm going to Vall. Mission profile has been decided that we're going to go to Vall first, and then we're going to leave the rest of the mission profile for the next video. But for now, we have plenty of fuel. That entire orange tank is 100% full, plus the train's tanks are full, the 3 tanks it has. So yeah, we're starting with Vall because it's so close. So basically, I got a Vall encounter on my Laythe exit burn, so I just burned hard for this this capture, and now I'm moving the crew into the lander. and we're gonna land on Vall. We're gonna use the space tug to pull the cargo container off the train, and then once the container is off the train, the crew is gonna decouple the docking ports that hold the cargo container onto the train, and then it's gonna have just the lander to land on Vall. Gotta bring the tug back to the train, because the train actually doesn't have a probe core, so when the train doesn't have the tug attached and there's no Kerbals in, it's just floating there in space. So it's important I redock as quickly as possible so that I have control over the whole train. Because all 3 crew members are on the lander here. You see 2 are sitting on the outside, because there's no atmosphere, right? There's no danger. The only thing they have to worry about is the G-forces, so as long as they're buckled in real tight, they're good. Because their suits are plenty of oxygen. This is a short mission, just down to the moon surface. We're going to investigate something on the surface, and then get right back into orbit and continue the mission, since we've got plenty of fuel. Remember, the star yacht is still orbiting Laythe too, because it's there with some fuel in it, but not enough to return to Kerbin. So part of the profile was always to be any excess fuel at the end of the mission was to get dumped into the star yacht. But even now, with how much fuel is left, I actually could consider a trip leaving the ship in orbit as a ship to return back to Kerbin if anybody on the surface of Laythe ever wants to go home. With how much fuel's left, I could leave it in orbit around Laythe and possibly do that. So, alright, I'm coming in for my Vall landing. I killed all of my horizontal velocity now, so I'm just falling. And I'm going to do a pretty ballsy maneuver here. In order to try and save fuel, I'm going to wait to throttle until the last possible second. Alright, so I kill all of my velocity, come to a stop, and then gently fall to the ground. At about 5 meters per second, I think it was there. And so the reason I did that is because those 2 tanks on the side were the what I call the landing tanks, and I needed those to be full of fuel. I needed that top tank to be my return to orbit tank. So those 2 tanks served their purpose. I have 1 liter of fuel left in each one, which means they did exactly what they needed to do. I landed. All right, so Delavray, I think his name is driving around. Oh, he sees something. Oh, what's that?